see, that brings us this evening then to our subject of Behemoth, Leviathan, and the unicorn. Last week we looked at, among other things, we covered some other things besides this. We looked at the dragon, the satyr, and doleful creatures. The week before that we covered other animals, the ass, birds, the owl, the cormorant, things like that. A couple of weeks ago we looked at the cockatrice, which was one of the controversial animals. And most of our time, I think, was spent in the last message, at least on the dragon and the satyr, and I think we finished up with the doleful creatures there of Isaiah 13. You remember the dragon appears around 30 times, but then there's 30 times in the Old Testament. And we left none of the King James usages of the word dragon. We left none of them as dragons. Changed most of them to jackals. Some of them were changed to crocodiles. Some to serpents or serpents. And then the remaining ones, like the one our text here in Genesis 1, was translated as sea monster, because this is really what the Hebrew word means when it's used in the context of some type of aquatic mammal or reptile. Then on the satyr, that appeared 4 times. That was a little confusing, you see, to the King James translators, because the word is the same word they translated goat everywhere else in the Old Testament, but they were smart enough to know when they came to these certain passages, like the one there in Leviticus, one in 2 Chronicles, and 2 in Isaiah, that the context in which this word satyr, in the Hebrew word for satyr or satyr, appeared, showed right away was probably something different than that they had been used to translating the word as before. Such is the case there in Isaiah 13, where you've got whatever type of creature it is dancing with all types of other weird and strange creatures in the ruins of Babylon. He don't do things like that. But since the word means a hairy one or a shaggy-haired one, and they knew from, you see, the King James translators were knowledgeable enough in mythology to know they had heard of something that was a half goat and half man, called a satyr, the animal that followed around the Greek god Bacchus or Dionysus. And since the word actually did mean goat, and they had translated it that way other times, why couldn't this be a satyr? Since as far as they were concerned, either a creature like that really did exist, or the writers of the Bible just included things like that to get their point across, even though things such as a half goat and half man didn't really exist. That's probably the reason why they translated it like that. Not because they really thought that the unicorn had existed, but because they thought that the writers of the Bible would include fictional creatures like that to get across their point. Now, the writers of the Bible include some strange type of creatures, but notice none of these are fictional, though. None that we've seen so far are fictional, which is interesting in itself. Now, if you go back to Genesis 1, I want to mention again how and why we got off on this subject. The how is found in Genesis 1:21, where we got the Hebrew word tannin, T-A-N-N-I-N, and God created great tannin. That's how we got off on it, because the word simply doesn't mean whale. The why, as far as why we got off on the subject, is because if we mention what that word is and what it doesn't mean, or it can't be restricted to, and that is it can't be restricted to whales, then right away someone out there would have come up with, well, what about the unicorn and the satyr and Behemoth and Leviathan? We had to have gone ahead and looked at these things anyway. And so that is the why we've gotten off on it, because they've caused these types of animals in the Bible, have caused people so many problems on wondering, are they erroneous? The Bible writers, are they erroneous in writing about these animals, or are they simply bowing to the superstition of the people in order to get across their point? Now, if a person believes that, well, that is what a lot of the modernists believe today. Jesus didn't actually believe in demons, but the people, superstitious of their time, believed in evil spirits inhabiting people, and so he simply condescended to their level. And he knew it was some type of functional disorder in the person, but he pretended like it was some spirit in him called a demon, and that's why he talked to the demons. The only problem is they talk back to him, though. And emotional disorders don't just all of a sudden change the tone of voice from a nice 90-year-old school teacher to a brawling wrestler's voice just on the drop of a hat. So if you begin to believe that maybe they condescended because, after all, the people back then were superstitious, then the problem arises, maybe they did that, maybe Jesus did that during the gospel. There weren't any really miraculous healings or things like that. That's just what the people wanted to see, and Jesus was a good a magician, and he could bring those things about. Well, some archaeologists, I think, would want to be here this evening, and you might be a little surprised on what we end up with on these animals here. Now, the three, as I said, that we'll be looking at are Behemoth, Leviathan, and the unicorn. Let's start with the last one, with the unicorn, and then we'll come to Behemoth and Leviathan in a moment. Now, you just may be surprised. See, some of you, we kept you guessing so long, you're afraid to guess. Because, at one time, you probably thought, well, of course things like that existed, and then at another time you thought, well, maybe they didn't really exist. Maybe, we showed you other places, the Nebraska man and the Cro-Magnon man, and these things weren't real. The Nebraska man, the Piltdown man was proven hoaxes. And so you think, well, maybe the dinosaurs are a hoax. And therefore, you don't know which way to guess, pro or con, true or false, which is true. Well, let's start on the unicorn, because this is an animal that never existed. And the other two, Behemoth and Leviathan, they'll fit in a different category, so we'll have to save them for themselves. But the unicorn is an animal that doesn't exist today and that never did exist before. Now, a unicorn, according to what the word actually means, is a horse, not a goat. Now, you might find a goat, say they've been able to get one horn to grow on his head, but a unicorn is a horse, and supposed to be a rather large one, that has one spiral horn that sticks out on his head that he's able to jab things with. It appears 8 times. The English word unicorn appears 8 times in the Old Testament. And it's a translation of the Hebrew word reem, R-E-E-M. And it doesn't appear at all in the New Testament. And I'll give you the passages. Numbers 23:22, Numbers 24:8, Deuteronomy 33:17, Job 39:9-10, Psalm 22:21, 29:6, 92:10, too fast, and Isaiah 34:7. Start again, you didn't get any of those? Numbers 23:22, Numbers 24:8, Deuteronomy 33:17. Either you're slow or I'm going too fast. Job 39:9-10, Psalm 22:21, 29:6, 92:10, and Isaiah 34:7. That would be 8 times this word appears. Did you miss one? R-E-E-M. R-E, and then what would be a backwards apostrophe E-M. Let me give you some characteristics of the animal. You see, again, since this is an animal that appears this many times in the Old Testament, Some places you see you've got more than one verse, like in Job 39, you've really got about 4 verses there where the animal is spoken of, even though its name, I think, only appears twice there. Therefore, we've got a little material that we can work with to find out, well, what exactly is this animal like? Now, even if the name ends up unicorn, if it said that it had webbed feet and swam in the ocean, if that was part of one of the passages, well, right away, that would help us determine it's not anything like what people think a unicorn is. Now, they don't give us that extreme of a character of the animal, but we have some very interesting things that just prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that it's not the unicorn. First of all, the animal is said to be extremely strong. Numbers 23:22. Well, let's see, both of the passages in Numbers and the one in Job. Well, it's really verse 11 in Job, Job 39:11. And both of the passages in Numbers depict this animal as being an extremely strong animal. I guess we'll go ahead and look at them as we go along at these characteristics. Numbers 23:22. So it says that he's very strong, and a unicorn was a very strong animal, so this would be a text that we could not use to prove that a unicorn is not spoken of here. Numbers 23:22. And of course, both of these first texts, both of these in Numbers, happen to be mentioned by this false prophet Balaam. But don't let that throw you off, because he also prophesied Numbers 23:19, and he was right there. So just because he prophesied a unicorn, remember, he didn't prophesy a unicorn, he prophesied a ram. And just because he happens to be a false prophet now doesn't mean that he missed it here on the unicorn. So remember that. He didn't prophesy in English, in other words. God brought them out of Egypt. He has, as it were, the strength of a unicorn. So it tells us that the nation of Israel is as strong as a unicorn here. Then in chapter 24 and verse 8, it says essentially the same thing. God brought him forth out of Egypt, speaking of the nation of Israel, personified in one individual person as he. He hath, as it were, the strength of an unicorn. He shall eat up the nations, his enemies, and shall break their bones and pierce them through with his arrows. Then over in Job 39:11, we're not going to turn to that. We'll turn to that under the next characteristic. That characteristic, number 2, being that this animal was completely untamable. We see that in Job 39, beginning with verse 9. He was an untamable animal. This animal has crept over into a lot of stories, not the type of stories that you want to put your children to bed with, by the way. I got put to bed with things like Rumpelstiltskin and Rip Van Winkle and the Headless Horseman and all types of things that would be enough to make you demon-possessed whenever you're trying to grow up and learn how to live in the world, and you get all this pumped into you and you end up needing deliverance before you're, 1 or 2 years old. I don't know, I guess parents are looking for fantastic stories to tell their children, but the Bible gives fantastic stories. I mean, if you want something miraculous, read the crossing of the Red Sea or something like that. You got plenty of miraculous stories that, to me, well, now, of course, they're much more exciting than a headless horseman or something like that. And they want, you see, all these have occult associations because they're mysterious, and the Bible says there's nothing more mysterious, 1 Timothy 3:16, than the mystery of godliness. Read them some from the Gospels. There you understand some of the mystery of godliness. God was manifest in the flesh, justified in the Spirit, seen of angels, preached to the Gentiles, believed on in the world, and received up into glory. That's from incarnation all the way to glorification. And that's the mystery, and that's worth reading. But don't put them to bed with stories about unicorns and imps and fairies and little men sliding down the chimney and eating cookies that you left on your table for them. How pagan and how ignorant. That's one thing that I was smart enough to catch, because I just sat up one night and watched the cookies and they never disappeared. So I figured right away, someone's either he missed it or my parents missed it. I mean, one or the other. I know I didn't miss it because I sat there and watched, and the thing stayed there. That's what a child ought to do. Some of us just been smart aleck since we've been born. So if you've been that way, you could have done the same thing. You see, I guess the parent is supposed to, I've never done it, but the parent is supposed to get up and eat the cookies before the child gets up the next morning. But children by nature are so hyperactive, it seems like they can hardly go to bed, and it'd be a trial for the parents to have to get up. What a bad time of the year for parents. To have to get up, you know your hyperactive child's going to beat you up in the morning anyway. What a trial. It puts you in debt until you die, and your children have to assume your debt once you're gone. Well, we're over in Job 39. Second characteristic is that he is untamable. Verse 9, will the unicorn be willing to serve thee or abide by thy crib? Canst thou bind the unicorn with his band in the furrow, or will he harrow the valleys after thee? In other words, what he's saying here is he's completely untamable. This animal is of such great strength and ferocity that you couldn't harness him with a yoke to plow anything that you wanted to plow. You simply couldn't catch the thing. So it is some type of animal that's described here. Now, verse 11 does mention his strength. Wilt thou trust him because his strength is great? I mean, rather than having 10 yoke of oxen like Elisha had when Elijah found him, you'd probably only need one of these animals to do the work. Wilt thou leave thy labor to him? Wilt thou believe him that he will bring home thy seed and gather it into thy barn? So you see verses 9, 10, 11, and 12 all speak of this animal here, that he's untamable. Then, thirdly, we see that he has playful young. From Psalm 29 and verse 6. I don't even think we'll have to look at all the scriptures. We'll just have to look at the ones that reveal some type of characteristic or outstanding feature about this animal. Now, since we don't really know much about the unicorn, we don't know whether his young were playful or not. But whatever animal this is, it had playful young ones. Psalm 29:6. He maketh them also to skip like a calf, Lebanon and Syrian like a young unicorn. So you have the picture of playful animals here. Lebanon, Syrian, of course, these are two mountains here. Syrian was simply the Phoenician name for what the Israelites called Mount Hermon. Then in Isaiah 34 and verse 7, this animal is associated with bulls. Now, from what we know about unicorns, we know this wasn't true. It was just like he had one horn. He was a solitary animal, and he always wanted to stay by himself. This animal, Isaiah 34:7, was able to associate with bulls. And the unicorn shall come down with them, and the bullocks with the bulls, and their land shall be soaked with blood, and their dust made fat with fatness. Notice in your margin, they give us rhinoceros, or we call it a rhinoceros today. So they weren't for sure by the time they got to the last usage of the word in Isaiah 34:7. I guess their conscience had convicted them by then. This is just ridiculous, what the Bible has ended up with these marginal readings like this. Why put it here and why not on all those other places there? Unless their conscience convicted them by the time they got to Isaiah 34. Well, we know there's no such thing as a unicorn. Let's just put a rhinoceros in there so that if anyone years to come criticizes us, they'll see we knew all along it was a rhinoceros they were talking about, and we got the thing here in the margin. Now, no one really believes that it's a rhinoceros. Now, that fits on some of the other animals according to some people, but no one even believes that that animal fits in here because it won't fit all these characteristics here. And besides that, he really has more than one horn. He's got a little snub of one, and then he's got his regular long horn. But the fifth and final characteristic, Deuteronomy 33:17, is the most interesting one, and it proves beyond a shadow of a doubt. You see, all we got to do is know enough about the Bible, and we have to run the references. This is why we're running most, if not all, of the references on these various animals, because you have to be thorough if you're going to be correct in what you believe. I was listening to a tape by a brother tonight on the life of Paul, and he was putting together some chronology. I was listening before I came here, studying some in Galatians, and I can prove beyond a shadow of a doubt he's wrong in several places there, because he's not taking the time to run all the references. He has assumed some things about the chronology of the life of Paul. And I came up and told her I can prove beyond a shadow of a doubt from Galatians 1 and 2 and Acts 9 through 15 that several places there they're wrong. That's why I want to take the time to look at the references so that we can be thorough enough to be correct. If you're not thorough, generally you're not going to be correct then. So we don't apologize for taking time out to discuss things like the unicorn. Deuteronomy 33, verses 13 through 17, in the prophetic blessing, Joseph is being discussed in these aforementioned verses, and specifically the two sons that come from his loins, Ephraim and Manasseh. Now that is important in itself in understanding the usage of the word. The King James translators at this point got caught, and they really didn't know what to do, so they just simply became dishonest, as I will show you. Verse 17. Now this is speaking of Joseph here. His glory is like the firstling of his bullock, and his horns, notice that it's plural horns here, are like the horns of unicorns. Now, before going on, since the Hebrew has got twice their horns in the plural, we know that a unicorn only has one horn. You're going to have to get a plurality of unicorns in here, or it's simply not going to fit the usage. Now, do you see what they've given us in our margin? Hebrew and unicorn singular. And that's what the Hebrew says. The Hebrew's got a singular animal here, in other words, in verse 17, and not a plural. Now, what that ends up proving is that the animal has to have at least two horns. You following me enough in Deuteronomy 33:17? If it's a plurality of horns, and the Hebrew gives us only one animal, it's not unicorns like you've got in the text, it's what you've got in the margin. Although it's not unicorn, it's a singular animal. If horns are plural and animal is singular, the animal has to have at least two horns in order to fit the text. Now, they saw that here, that it was horns, that horns was used twice, both of them in the plural, and it goes on to say, and with them, and you've got another plural, and it's speaking of the horns, but of only one animal, it had to be plural. How many horns was it? We know. He goes on to tell us, with them he shall push the people together to the ends of the earth. Speaking of Joseph. What's Joseph's two horns? They. What's the they? It's the horns. Horn number 1 is Ephraim. Horn number 2 is Manasseh. So we've got a proof text that tells us the King James unicorn had two horns on it. Which right away we're going to have to call him a bicorn from now on rather than a unicorn, if anything. Because that makes him a bicorn and not a unicorn. Well, in all these places the word should be a wild ox. In every place it should be a wild ox. Not a tamed ox. That's a different type and a different species. We still have oxen with us today, but the wild ox, the last one died in Poland in the 17th century, in the 1600s, is when we have the recording of the last of this particular species of animal. It was a famous animal hunted by the Assyrian kings. Back in Assyria, centuries ago, it was like a sport animal to them that they hunted the unicorn or the wild ox and the wild oxen. And Julius Caesar mentions it in his Gallic Wars. He saw this exact animal here over in Spain whenever he was doing his traveling and doing his conquering before he came to the throne there in Rome. Now you say, well, how did we end up with the word like we've got it in the King James? Well, for a couple of different reasons. First of all, the LXX. We've gotten a lot of good things from it, but some things that are not so good. The LXX translated this Hebrew word with the Greek word monokeros, M-O-N-O-K-E-R-O-S. K-E-R-O-S. And you ought to be able to tell right away from the word, it means a one-horned animal. That's what Septuagint put in every one of these places. It put monokeros, which means a one-horned animal. Where did the Septuagint translators get it? Remember, they're translating from around 250 to 150 BC, about 100 years when the Septuagint is being completed. They got it from relief representations from Babylonian mosaics and Egyptian drawings. And in these Babylonian mosaics and these Egyptian drawings, which the translators of the LXX had seen, since they were done in strict profile, you only have one dimension, and therefore all you can see is one horn. And they had seen pictures in Babylonian mosaics and Egyptian drawings where you got two horns, but if you're looking at it straight on from a side view, all you can see is one horn. So you assume, well, it must be a unicorned or horned animal. And so they put the word in here, monokeros. And after that, Aristotle and Pliny. Aristotle was, of course, Greek and Pliny Roman. In their natural history, both evidently fell in the same era and have helped to perpetuate the memory of the unicorn all the way down into this day. Now, just like the mermaids, we could trace the mermaids back to the dugong. And a lot of these things can either be traced back to, well, one of three things. Either evil spirits that have manifested themselves in some form, such as the satyr, or a real animal, or a misconception. Now, one of those three things is why we've got the various animals like a unicorn. Either a demon manifested himself at an earlier time as some strange species. That's where we get things like imps from. Demons have manifested themselves as little men that sit on your bedpost and leave tiny little footprints whenever you wake up in the morning. Demons have appeared to people like that. Anyone knowledgeable in the occult wouldn't dispute that. That's a proven fact. Now, if that isn't the base for it, then it's because we've got a real animal that really did exist back then, such as Behemoth and Leviathan. Whatever those are, those happen to be two real animals. Or the third thing, which is where we can trace the unicorn back to, is simply a misunderstanding or a misconception or a misrepresentation of a real animal that did exist. And because they would look at a profile with only the one dimension and see what appeared to be one horn, the other horn was hidden behind the first horn, the front horn, then as a result, this is where they picked it up, and this is how we've got it into our Bible, and unicorns never have existed, and they don't exist. Well, you have any questions on unicorns? We're going to come next to Behemoth. Behemoth, this Hebrew word, appears 9 times. At least 9 times in the Old Testament. Some other times are a little questionable. If you don't know how to spell all these, we'll come to them in the Bible and you'll see them. But it occurs at least 9 times in the following passages: Deuteronomy 32:24, Job 12:17, Job 40:15, Psalm 49:12 and 20, Psalm 50:10, Psalm 73:22, Jeremiah 12:4, and Habakkuk 2:17. Now there's a little dispute over how many times the word in the Hebrew appears, but even if it appears more than this, that's not going to affect our final conclusions about the animal one way or the other. Because if you know anything about Job 40, that's the crucial passage to understand right there. Regardless of where the word appears other places, Job 40 is going to be the crucial passage. Now, in most of these passages that I've just given you, the word is either rendered as beasts in the plural, I think once it might have been singular there, or as cattle. However, in Job 40:15, the word is used as a plural of intensity. The Hebrews have different types of plurals. And it's used in Job 40 and verse 15 as the plural of intensity because they recognize that some type of distinct and specific creature was being referred to in Job 40. Therefore, they don't try to give us any translation of the word. They just leave us with the Hebrew, Behemoth. That's what the Hebrew is, Behemoth. So they just leave us with that, not giving us a translation, because they recognize that it has reference to some specific animal. Now let's start with Deuteronomy 32:24, and you'll see that you won't find it appearing as Behemoth in any of these other passages. I don't think that Behemoth only appears there in Job 40, because, as I said, the Hebrew word is found in these other places. And by the way, all the word is and all the word means, it means beast, and it's the plural of the word beast. Every time you see the word beast, or most of the time, you've got different Hebrew words, but let's just say most of the time where you see the word beast in the Old Testament, it is simply the singular of Behemoth. And Behemoth, in other words, is simply the plural of just your ordinary beast, whether it's a lion or a tiger, or doesn't make any difference. It's simply a plural that means beast. Now here in Deuteronomy 32:24, I believe it's translated this way. They shall be burnt with hunger and devoured with burning heat, and with bitter destruction I will also send the teeth of Behemoth upon them, with the poison of serpents of the dust. Now, you ought to just leave that beast, because that's what he has reference to, just some type of beast. But what I'm saying is, the translators recognize that this was just used in a general sense most of the times in the Old Testament. Only when they came to the problem passage of Job 40 did they recognize that an entirely different animal and something specific is being referred to there. Not Behemoth as beast plural, but a single animal, although the word was plural, but they used it as a plural of intensity. In other words, he was a beast and then some. That's why they would use the word as a plural of intensity, even though they're talking about a singular animal, because he was a beast and then some. Job 12:7. I think it occurs the same here. But ask now the beasts, and they shall teach thee, and so forth. Then Psalm 49:12, 49:20, the same. But look over in Psalm 50, in verse 10. Now here they give us a different translation of the word in Psalm 50 and 10. But every beast, now that's not the word because that's singular, of the forest is mine, and the Behemoth upon 1,000 hills. And here they translate it as cattle, which is fine also. Jeremiah 12:4. You have a question, brother? Jeremiah 12:4. Well, it's the same Hebrew word, I'm saying. It's the same Hebrew word that appears all throughout. In other words, we shouldn't really call the animal Behemoth, because that's just saying beast. That's all that Hebrew's saying is beast in the plural. But they didn't know what to call the animal. They didn't know what type of name to put on this animal. And since the Hebrew word was a plural, and they recognized it was used as a plural of intensity, they decided we'll just leave the word like that. In other words, we've got a lot of words that are in both the Old and New Testament that have simply been left to us untranslated, like the word Maranatha. We should have that word translated, the Lord comes. But there are certain words they chose just to leave untranslated. And so it's just simply untranslated in the passage in Job that we'll look at in a moment. How long shall the land mourn and the herbs of every field wither? For the wickedness of them that dwell therein, the beasts are consumed and the birds, because they said, he shall not see our last end. And Habakkuk 2:17. We'll just look at it. I'm pretty sure it says the same thing. For the violence of Lebanon shall cover thee, and the spoil of beasts. So you see, it says the same thing. Here are the times we see this particular form of this plural word used. Now, almost universally, people ascribe to this animal one of three others, either the rhinoceros, the elephant, or the hippopotamus. Your RSV, NIV, and NAS versions give you hippopotamus in the margin. RSV, NIV, NASB, and probably others, I didn't look them up, give you hippopotamus in the margin, and the AV, the KJV, gives you elephant in the margin, and a variety of others give you rhinoceros. So generally you've got your pick between a rhinoceros, an elephant, or a hippopotamus as to exactly what this animal is. Now let's go over to Job 40, because this is the best passage, and I think we can find out exactly what this animal is by studying this passage. It's not that many hold to rhinoceros. It's more of a toss-up between an elephant and a hippopotamus, and the vast majority of people believe that it's a hippopotamus because of some of the characteristics that are given of the animal. But I might add there are at least two characteristics that I remember from the animal that don't fit either one of these three animals. And in other words, we're going to have to invent some other type of animal that all of the characteristics will fit. And I know there's two of them here that don't fit either the rhinoceros, the hippopotamus, or the elephant. All right, now Job 40 and 15. First of all, notice they've just left us the Hebrew word behemoth. The same word we've seen translated beasts or cattle in the other places. Now, in your margin, the elephant as something. So there's where you have your marginal reference, and that is, of course, strictly wrong. That certainly shouldn't be there. Well, let's go through these verses like we've done before and look at some characteristics of the animal. First of all, it was some type of animal living in Job's day, which means it had to be an animal that was extant in 2000 BC. Which, you see, that might, restrict it as far as some people are concerned, and it does. It has to be an animal living then, because God says, behold now Behemoth. He says, look at Behemoth. So he had to be around for Job to see. So he had to be an animal living in 2000 BC. It doesn't mean necessarily that he has to be living today. He just had to be living 4,000 years ago. Then something else I want to mention as far as the characteristic goes is I want you to remember that beginning with chapter 38 of Job, we have direct communication that's been given to Job by God. Now, if the first half of Job, maybe that's mythological, but I would never believe these last chapters are, because these descriptions of animals and of stars and of planets and things came directly from the mouth of God. So remember, he probably knew what he was talking about when he mentioned these animals and when he gave certain characteristics about them. Now, along with that, I want you to remember, nothing that we've looked at in Job so far has been mythological. If you'll go back to chapter 38, remember how specific he was in talking about the various stars and constellations that we looked at earlier. He was very specific in what he said, and what he said was right, and what he said was true. Canst thou bind the cluster, 38:31, of Pleiades, or loose the bands of Orion? Canst thou bring forth Mazzaroth? And we've already covered all these, what they are. In his season, or canst thou guide Arcturus with her sons? Then in chapter 39, verses 9 through 12, no mythological creature there anymore, no unicorn. It's a wild ox that he has reference to. So since everything that he has been speaking to Job thus far has been real and true, God's not using mythology, it only follows that this particular animal must be a real animal that was alive during Job's day. Now that wouldn't give us any problem with the rhinoceros, elephant, or hippopotamus, but maybe some other creature, such as just a creature of mythology, would cause a problem here, because this is what God is giving. And he gives the characteristics, and they're right. Then thirdly, we see from verse 15 of chapter 40 that he was created at the same time as man. In other words, it has to be a land mammal, and he was created on the 6th day, not on the 5th day. Leviathan is back on the 5th day. Behemoth is on the 6th day of creation, which makes a distinction between whether it's a land mammal or a marine mammal or reptile or fish. Behold now Behemoth, that tells us that he's alive in Job's day, which I made with thee. Now go back to Genesis chapter 1, verse 24, and God said, let the earth bring forth the living creature after his kind, cattle, creeping thing, and beast of the earth after his kind. The 6th day of creation, all these various beasts are made, man included. Then another characteristic, he was a herbivorous animal, both when he was created and in Job's day. He was totally herbivorous. Means he didn't eat meat. He ate grass and things like that. Herbivorous. And of course that's said in Genesis 1. I've given you every green grass and plant and fruit, and to you it shall be food, but you're not to eat meat. Now we know that some animals afterwards ate meat, including man. This is one animal that continued to remain herbivorous even after the fall and after the flood. You see, whatever type of animal this is, he survived the flood too, because the flood took place several thousand years before that, and this animal is still around. We get that from the same verse, verse 15. Behold now Behemoth, which I made with thee, he eateth grass as an ox. Well, that doesn't present a problem with the other animals either. A 5th characteristic, he was a huge, powerful creature through his midsection. Verse 16. A huge, powerful creature through his midsection. Lo now, his strength is in his loins, and his force is in the navel of his belly. So in other words, it's just saying he was huge through the midsection area. Now we come to one of the 2 characteristics that totally rules out the rhinoceros, the elephant, and the hippopotamus. And that is found in verse 17. He moveth his tail like a cedar. Well, have you ever seen a cedar for a tail on a hippopotamus, a rhinoceros, or an elephant? Well, they got about the smallest tails you could have. And this animal had a tail like a cedar tree. Now, you know what the cedars of Lebanon are like. Huge things, known for their sturdy strength and durability. So this animal has a tail like a cedar tree. Now that rules out right away rhinoceros, elephant, and hippopotamus. Without trying to prove what it is, it rules those 3 out. Because none of those meet the condition here of having a tail like a cedar. Now the reason I started off by saying, remember that God is the one that gave the description. He's not just talking in symbolism here. A lot of things are used in symbolism in the Old Testament, but God's not talking in symbolism. Everything he says so far is real and true. Everything that he said in 38 and 39 is real and true. Therefore, 40 and 41 must fit the same category. He's not speaking symbolically in any of these passages. He means what he says here, and it's a true characterization of whatever animal he has reference to. So this one has a tail like a cedar tree. Then, I don't know what number, I've got 7 here. His bones are as strong as iron. Verse 18, his bones are as strong as pieces of brass. His bones are like bars of iron. Another characteristic, he is the largest of all land creatures that God ever made. Verse 19, he is the chief of the ways of God. No, you can't guess ahead of time. You see that in verse 19. He is the chief of the ways of God. In other words, he's the greatest. Now we have to put the restriction, land creature that God ever created. He is the chief of the ways of God. Now, we come to the second of, as I said, our two characteristics that disprove the rhinoceros, the elephant, and the hippopotamus. That being, this animal spent time both in the mountains and in the marshes. Spent time in both places. It was comfortable, in other words, for a habitat in the mountains or a habitat among the reeds and the rushes in the marshes. Now, a hippopotamus and an elephant, they just love the marshes. But you don't see many hippopotamuses climbing up the sides of mountains, though. They'd be out of their territory. The same for an elephant and a rhinoceros. Where do you see them? On flat plains in Africa or wherever. You don't see them climbing up the mountains. Now, just because Hannibal took his elephants over in the Second Punic War, the Alps, to Rome, of course, a lot of them died, doesn't mean that's their natural habitat. But this animal was comfortable in both places. That's verses 20 through 22. Surely the mountains bring him forth food where all the beasts of the field play. So right away you again see he's herbivorous, or you wouldn't have beasts playing around him. In other words, he wasn't going to hurt any other animals because he didn't eat meat, he ate the grass. He could be up in the mountains. Or verse 21. He lieth under the shady trees in the covert of the reed and fens. The shady trees cover him with their shadow. The willows of the brook compass him about. There you see him in the water, so he can fit both places. Then verse 23, we see a 10th characteristic. He was unafraid of swollen torrents of water.
For the continuation of this message, please turn the tape